I'm Antelo, and I'm going to present this talk that is called How Do Survivors Move Forward? Exploring coping profiles after leaving abusive groups. This is a preliminary study. I've still divided the paper and finished the paper, so maybe the final paper has different results from what I present today, but they, they will be not very different. Okay. So, first of all, I don't know if you know us, but for doing a little moment of spam, I'm from Invictus Research Group. We are from Spain, from the University of Barcelona. Here, uh, I'm with Omar Saldaña, that is from the group. Well, we study psychological abuse applied to different contexts. And one of them is groups, cultic groups. We prefer to talk about abusive groups. But we also study psychological abuse in terrorism or moving, the workplace, and sexual exploitation. But I'm going to focus in abusive groups. So if you are interested in our papers or uh, our research, I will conduct at the end of it. So first, I started because we don't have a lot of time. And as I said, we prefer to talk about abusive groups instead of cults because for us, abusive groups are defined by the psychological abuse strategies, not the ideology or other characteristics, is the abuse that they use to recruit, manipulate, and control their members. So, actually, we also don't like very much to talk about abusive groups. We prefer to talk about people who have experienced psychological abuse within a group because we cannot study all the groups. So study the experience that people live. So during this presentation, I'm going to say abusive groups, but I'm talking about experience of people. Okay. So one of our research line is to study the consequences. My doctoral thesis was about that. So, well, we know from other studies that survivors of group psychological abuse, but we know that survivors of group psychological abuse say no, face a unique and complex set of emotional, cognitive, and social realities. Now that people, when leave an abusive group, they have to deal with a lot of demands, daily problems, but also rebuilding their life after leaving the group. So there is these two things, no? Recovering from the traumatic experience and all the problems that everybody has in their daily lives that can be more or less stressful. Mm. So in this line, we have, I don't know if, I think we presented this in another ICSA conference, but we developed a taxonomy of different psychosocial difficulties that survivors can experience or report after living in abusive groups. If anyone is interested, talk to me and we will send you the paper. It's in Spanish and English and no more languages, I think. For now, these are the languages. So we identified emotional difficulties like, for example, grief, guilt or shame, sadness, anger. Cognitive difficulties like decisions, difficulties for taking, sorry, my English, for taking decisions, for life or life, critical thinking, identity problems. This is more developed in the paper of the taxonomy. I'm doing like a brief. So, relational and social difficulties. So, this is difficulties for, I don't know, establishing new relationships, trusting other people, or also problems with studies or work, these kind of social problems, and other specific problematic behaviors like sleeping or food or sexual problems, substance abuse. And on the other hand, we know for our studies and other studies and work from clinicians that survivors also can report depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. So the thing is, well, we know that people after a traumatic experience, in this case abusive groups, can report all of this. But some of them report more and some of them report less. So one of our research line that is my recent research line is why. What which are the factors that influence that some people report more or some people report less distress. If we know that, we can understand better their practices, the relationship with the neuropsychological abuse experience, and we can also, as a clinicians, can, can do more effective interventions and more specialized or tailored to the experience of the people. So we know from other interpersonal violence like intimate partner violence or moving that one factor that is studied is coping. I don't know if you are familiar with this term coping. Yeah. Okay, and you are familiar with the Lazarus and Fallman transactional model of stress and coping? Okay, so I'm going to explain a little of this model because this is my studies based in this model. Okay, so Lazarus and Folkman says that people, everybody, in their daily life have to respond to various demands, like in work, in study, with your family, I don't know. And these demands can be more or less stressful. So when there is a demand in our environment, it happens to phenomena, cognitive assessment and coping strategies. I'm going to focus in this, but I'm going to explain that for understanding the model. So cognitive assessment says that when a stressful event happens or a demand, we assess if this event, this demand, is positive, neutral, or negative. Depending of which perception we have of this event, we are going to respond in a way or another. If I don't explain well, tell me, and I said in another way. So what happened? We can say, okay, this what this happened is very negative, is stressful. So I'm going to what can I do to respond to this demand? So we have the coping strategies. The coping strategies for these authors is the cognitive and behavioral efforts we do to manage, reduce, or tolerate this stressor, this stressful event. What we do to reduce the stressful, and we have all of us different ways, or cope for to this event. So these authors identified 14 strategies. Okay, I'm not going to explain each of them, but I think that for the name they are very intuitive. No, for example, when I explain this to my students in criminology and psychology, I says, tomorrow you have an exam. Maybe you says, okay, I'm not going to study, so I'm going to love with my friends, going in denial, and going to the bar and take a few drinks and not study. But maybe you says, okay, I have to study, I'm going to plan. I have 2 hours for study, and I'm going to do, and I'm going to cry to my mom and get emotional support. I don't know. So each of us has different all of these strategies. And I asked to my students, okay, after explaining this with more time, these strategies are adaptative or disadaptative or maladaptative. I don't know the term in English exactly which is. And usually they say, these are the positive, yeah, and these are the bad, more or less. And I ask them, really? You? Religion, spirituality is adaptative or maladaptative? Acceptance is always adaptative? I don't know. Venting, like crying a lot of hours, is always maladaptative? Well, and we start to discuss this in classroom, no? The well, Lazarus and Fallman, they say that instead of talking about individual strategies, we have to talk about coping style, that each of us has a way to deal with these events. So maybe you are more, you have a tendency to use humor and active coping and positive reinterpretation, and you and other strategies. No, so each of us has a personal and social tendency to use certain strategies or another ones. but we have the same problem, and which are the coping style, adaptative or maladaptative, no? And these authors identified 3 categories: problem focus strategies, emotion focus, and dysfunctional or avoidant. The problem focus strategies are the strategies that are aimed to modify the origin of the stress. For example, in this case, active coping or planning would be problem focused strategies. Okay, because it's like, I'm going to solve this. What can I do? More cognitive, we can say. The emotion focused strategies are the strategies aimed to regulate the emotion, the distress provoked by the event. So, for example, emotional support or venting. And the avoidant strategies are those strategies that, well, like the name says, is disengage with the stressful event, avoiding it. If I don't look it, it doesn't exist, more or less. It would be. And then they also says that these 2 strategies would be engagement coping, because it's a way that you deal with the problem directly, and the avoidant strategies would be disengagement coping. Did I explain this? Yeah, okay. I don't know how I have my time. So the study says coping strategies is a mediator between stressors and mental health. If you have a coping style more adaptative, you will have less distress. And if you have a coping style more maladaptative, you will have higher distress. And a study says that, well, like this, that problem focused coping is good, less distress, and emotion focus and withdrawal or disengagement or avoidance strategies are bad. This is what theory says, but study says that there are contradictory results. There is not an agreement in this. You can find studies that says that emotion focus are bad, and others that there is no significant relationship between stress and distress and the coping style. So this is one question. No? Well, and then, and we have another question. And in survivors of group psychological abuse, but until this time, I'm talking about the studies with intimate partner violence and childhood abuse and other violence. So to my knowledge, there is no quantitative study or qualitative study that address directly the coping styles. It's true that in qualitative study, they talk about coping, but not directly, not with a model or the strategies, or they not study directly this as a mediator. So, and there is a relationship. There is coping styles, a coping style in survivors of abusive group. This is the question that I had in my head. So we know, if we look at qualitative studies or quantitative studies, it has sense that thinking that survivors of abusive groups may have, this is the hypothesis, a characteristic coping style. For example, we know that in the group, in cultic groups, in abusive groups, they do isolation to their members. So after leaving the group, usually survivors of abusive groups has a less social network. So emotional support, instrumental support, this is coping strategies that maybe they don't have these resources, no? Or for example, the strategy of self-blame, if we think of abuse, emotional abuse and control over personal life, we can see that there can be a connection between group psychological abuse and some strategies that I presented before. But as we said, I didn't find any study about that. And on the other hand, a study that my colleague, we saw in another study that survivors of abusive groups reported higher levels of psychological stress when confronted with the demands of everyday life. So also we know this. So the question of this study is this increased stress related to the way they cope? Has the abusive experience shaped their coping style in any ways? Some of the questions. So the objective studies is to this study specifically, to identify coping styles among individuals who have experienced group psychological abuse, to examine how these profiles are related to the group psychological abuse experience, and also examine if these profiles are related to sex, age of entry into the group, people who have born or who, were born or have been raised within the group, times exiting the group, distress, etc. Which time is it more or less? Okay. We are the method. I'm going to be fast with this. So if anyone wants to know something about that, ask me later. In this study, 663 survivors or groups of group psychological abuse participate. I don't know, maybe some of you participate in this study because it was years ago. It was like a long questionnaire, long questionnaire, and a lot of people from ICSA participate. So thank you very much. Well, in this sample, most of the participants were women. The groups were religious. Not the half of the participants, but there were a lot of people who were born or raised within the group. Some of the other data. These are the instruments that we used, the psychological abuse experience in group scale, to measure the psychological abuse experience. We also use another scale that we developed in our research group, that is the inventory of psychosocial difficulties in survivors of abuse groups, that this scale measure the taxonomy that I talked before, emotional difficulties, cognitive difficulties. Well, this is an scale that we develop from this taxonomy, and this is Spanish and English first. And for measuring clinical symptoms, we use the brief symptom and the PCL, and for the coping, we use the brief cope inventory. Well, we use an online questionnaire, and I'm not going to explain very much the statistics because I don't know if you love statistics or not, but my experience is that people love statistics, so they say, anyone is interested in this, ask me. But only to say, for the profiles, we use latent profile analysis. It's a statistical procedure to identify profiles or groups and more statistics. So the results. This is the result of the latent profile analysis, and there are more things, but this is the graph. The model that showed the best fit, it was a model with 4 profiles. Okay, and these are I'm going to show them each of them more clear. So the red one is the profile 1, the 2 is the profile 2, 4 profiles. For explaining a little this, I don't know if you can watch it very well, but each of these are the strategies, okay, like religion, self-blame, humor, and these 0 to 5 are the scores for each strategy. So, for example, profile 1 has higher levels of self-destruction, and this is the graph more or less explained. So I'm going to explain each of the profiles because it's the interesting part. So the first profile, I have to say that I'm still thinking in the names for each profile. So this is preliminary. So the profile 1, I call them balanced or moderately engaged copers. Is the graph a lot of people, a lot of participants are in this profile. And these people, people in profile 1, show more use of strategies like active coping, emotional support, instrumental support, planning, and acceptance. This is strategies, problem-focused strategies, remembering the classification, and emotion-focused strategies. And they use less in comparison to the other profiles, they use less denial, behavioral disengagement, substance abuse, and religion. That this is interesting because what I'm going to say later. Okay, so these people show that they answer or respond to their daily problems and maybe trauma with these strategies. So we could say that it seems adaptative, no? More or less. It seems like okay. The second profile is very similar to this. The difference is that the score are more extreme. Okay. So I call them highly engaged or proactive copers and spiritual copers. This is because it's the only profile that has a high score in the religion or spirituality strategy. And I think this is very interesting because we are talking about abusive groups. Maybe in other violence, it doesn't matter very much, but in this case, especially because we know that these participants are from religious groups, that why for some people religion or spirituality is a adaptative strategy and for others maybe not. This is interesting. So participants in this profile, in profile 2, they show higher but very high levels of active coping, emotional support, planning, positive interpretation, acceptance, and religion. They has problem focused strategies and emotion focused strategies and very lower levels of denial, behavioral disengagement, and substance abuse. And now we go to the other two profiles, and you are going to see that they are completely different. Okay, you can see the graph. In profile 3, less people. The name is emotional overwhelmed copper. This is my interpretation of the data. I have still to explore them more. But these people show higher levels of use of self-destruction, denial, behavioral disengagement, venting, and self-blame. This is a higher use of emotion-focused strategies and avoidant strategies. So for that, I call them emotional overwhelm. They seem like when a stressful event happens, the distress is so high that this is like the study of my colleague show that they experience a lot of stress. So they use these strategies and they are overwhelmed by these emotions. It would be interesting to see why some events are different from people. And these participants too show less, it was expected more or less, lower levels of active coping, support seeking, instrumental and emotional, planning, acceptance, substance abuse, and religion too. Okay. And the other profile, the last profile, and this is really interesting. And if we have time, it would be lovely to discuss it, everybody, because I'm still thinking in this. I call them passive external copers. I'm still thinking about this one. These participants show higher levels of self-destruction, substance use. This is the only profile that has higher levels of substance use, behavioral disengagement, venting, self-blame, humor, and I don't know how to pronounce it in English. Acceptance. Okay, acceptance. So acceptance is good or is bad? So this profile is clearly avoidant. Avoidant. I don't know how to answer to these demands in my environment, so I don't look at it. I'm going to do another things. And they show also lower levels of active coping, positive interpretation, denial, and religion. As I said, religion is only high in the profile too. So after that, we have the profiles. So now we have to look. There is a relationship between being in a profile or another and the group psychological abuse. And we saw that people who were or show the profile 2 have experienced lower levels of psychological abuse within the group. So the intensity of psychological abuse experience, it matters, at least from what this study, this result says. And also people in the profile 4, the last one, reported higher levels of group psychological abuse. So higher levels of group psychological abuse may be related with more avoidant strategies or emotion focus strategies. About distress, like it is expected, people in profile 1 or 2, that they were the adaptative, show lower levels of psychosocial difficulties and clinical symptoms and post-traumatic symptoms. And people in profile 3 and 4, higher levels of distress. Okay, so it seems that coping is a mediator between the abuse and the distress. We have still to explore more this relationship, and with the qualitative studies, it would be also the ideal. Another data that I think that is interesting, we didn't find differences between sex or time spent within and outside the group, but with age, born or raised within the group, and age of entry, we find differences. Profile 4, that for remembering, profile 4 was this one, the avoidant, okay? Well, younger individuals, that people who were born or raised within the group, and this is very interesting, higher likelihood of having received psychological support after leaving. So, two hypotheses. Because they has higher distress, they go to psychological support, or the psychological support is not going very well, and because maybe it is not a specialized clinician in this violence, or I don't know, hypothesis. It could be interesting to see this. And another result that it was interesting, profile 3, that they were the overwhelmed, okay? It was not statistically significant, but participants from profile 3 show shorter time since leaving the group. So maybe with a higher number of participants, we would have found significant differences. But this number of participants, maybe it seems a lot for you, but for statistics, is low. So, and well, like a discussion and some conclusions for ending questions or debate or discuss. Okay, perfect. Some conclusions. There is no single uniform way of coping among survivors of abusive groups and disasters, because everyone is different. But it's true that we have found that there is some styles, no? Different styles, but we can find diversity. But there are profiles. Profiles 1 or 2, we could say that it is adaptative coping. At the start of the presentation, I was asking, on emotion focus, on problem focus, they are adaptative, not adaptative, acceptance. I think that the conclusion is that coping is not about good or bad strategies in isolation, is the combination of them, is the balance of the equilibrium. For example, acceptance. You can say, the example of the exam. Okay, I have an exam, I accept it, I'm going to study. Or you can say, okay, I have the exam, I accept it, I don't have time, I'm going to the bar. So acceptance is good or bad depending on the other strategies, and humor too. Maybe substance abuse, that not, this is more than maladaptative, but the other ones. So the thing is looking for the best combination of the strategies. And this is like we can see, profile 1 and 2, they show a combination of focus problem strategies and emotion focus strategies. So both of them are good. And I have to say that even avoidant strategies are good, because we need sometimes to avoid the problem. When I teach this to my students, I say the example of grief. When we lose someone, we cannot stay 24 hours crying and thinking about the problem. We need some hours to rest. And with trauma, it's the same. Or even a breakup. No? We have to avoid but too much avoidant is not helpful. And the same too, if you are planning all time, you are not going to address the problem. So each strategy is good or bad depending of the others. and the context of the situation. Well, it is another conclusion that lower levels of psychological abuse and psychological distress are related with this combination of strategies. And well, I ask about religion. It would be interesting to study more the spirituality, especially in this topic that we are talking, that the spirituality is so important, and religion. And there is, for what I could read, there is less little there is not a lot of studies about religion in psychology, okay? Because they are fed of religion in psychology. Yes. And also we know that profile 3 and 4, we could set that they show maladaptative coping because this combination of strategies are related to higher levels of distress. Maybe profile 3, this is my hypothesis, they are in a transitional stage of recovery because of this they are more overwhelmed to respond to trauma or daily problems. And profile 4 is very interesting, the use of humor and acceptance as a way to avoid the problem. And well, I'm going to be fast. I said all of this. So conclusions. Coping styles are not homogeneous among survivors. The objective, it seems, balance coping strategies, emotion focus, problem focus, and also avoidant strategies. And it is true that avoidant coping style is associated with greater distress if there is no balance, and being born and raised in the group is related to more avoidant coping styles. And this is interesting too. So my conclusion for clinician in this case, the understanding we have of this problem is that professionals should know the dynamics of the group to understand the recovery process, all of the coping styles or psychosocial difficulties. And well, only a sentence for ending that recovery lies not in erasing the past, but in mastering the ways we respond to it. This is our mails. So now if you want, I don't know if we have time for questions or discuss. Hi.